Good evening. After a few videos in which we have mentally wandered in the deserts of Middle East and Africa, today we go back to Rome, to the Rome of the 7th century, which we had left in lecture 6. We will deal with half-forgotten events that affected the relationship between the Roman Church and the Eastern Roman Empire and contributed thereby to the transition from the late antiquity to the Middle Ages. Let us start with the situation in Constantinople. In lecture 12, we had seen the beginning of the rule of Constans II, son of the first wife of Emperor Heraclius. In the year 642, he had become emperor after the Senate of Constantinople and the militaries had brutally got rid of Heraclius' second wife and of her son. Initially, Constans, then only 11 years old, had ruled under the guidance of the Senate. But later on, he revealed a strong personality and a determination to fight relentlessly against the enemies of the empire, Arabs, Slavs, and Lombards. In the lectures dedicated to the wars between the Roman Empire and the Caliphate, I have tried to convey the enormous cost that the religious controversies had for the empire. In Syria, where many communities of Jews and non-Orthodox Christians lived, several cities had opened the gates to the Caliphate's armies. In Egypt, the passivity of the Coptic population had decided the success of the Arab conquest. Finally, in the Exarchate of Africa, the reaction to the ecthesis of Heraclius, the edict that had tried to reconcile the Chalcedonian with the Monophysite doctrine, had even provoked a secession from the empire. Since religious conflict had been so costly, in 647, Constans issued a new decree, the Typos Peripisteos, which we could translate as the model of behavior in matters of faith. With it, Constans ordered the removal of the ecthesis from the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia and forbade any further discussion on the subject of the single energy or on the single will of the Christ. Ex post, the definition of insanity attributed to Albert Einstein comes to one mind: to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. In fact, as it had already happened for the ecthesis, and before it for the doctrine of monoenergism, an act intended as a reconciliation gesture turned out to have the opposite effect, because regardless of his intention, the emperor had stepped once more into the power sphere of the church. Now, let us go back to Rome, which we left in lecture 6 at the end of the papacy of Gregory I. Gregory I, probably the greatest pope of the Middle Ages, who died in 604, was followed by several much less eminent popes who ruled for very short periods. As a general comment, in the early Middle Ages, there were many very short pontificates, ending after a few months with the death of the Pope in office, of course, with a few notable exceptions. This raises questions, of course. Was it a reflection of poor life conditions? Or were ailing and old candidates intentionally chosen to be popes? Or were the lives of some of them terminated by poisoning? These are questions we cannot answer. As we saw already in the 7th century, the Italian peninsula was in a situation of poverty and cultural decline. However, after the death of Gregory, the church profited from what he had achieved. He had started missionary activities in Britain and established good relationships with the Visigoths, the Franks, and the Lombard kings. Many Lombard kings were now Catholic, and even those who adhered to Arianism were no longer hostile to the Catholic clergy. Over the years, the Roman Church had been gradually rebuilding the wealth that Gregory had abundantly employed to assist people displaced by the predations of the Lombards and affected by famine. After several short pontificates, in the year 625, Pope Honorius first ascended to the Holy See and ruled for 13 years, as long as Gregory I. As Gregory, he came from a prominent family of Italy. He stood out as a founder and restorer of churches after decades of neglect. Those works obviously employed materials from ancient Roman buildings like the bronze tiles of the Temple of Venus in Rome, built under Emperor Hadrian. They were used for the roof of St. Peter's Cathedral. Honorius had also adorned many other churches with precious decorations. In politics, he was a prudent man and agreed with Heraclius' wish to reconcile with the Monophysites by attributing a single will to both the human and the divine nature of the Christ. At the time, the imperial power was still very strong in Rome, although Gregory I, with his moral authority, eloquence, and political talent, had managed to defend the autonomy of the Pope. When the Bishop of Rome died, by then already called with the Greek word Papa, the archpresbyter, the archdeacon, and the primicerius of the notaries rushed to notify the exarch in Ravenna. Then they sent to Constantinople excerpts of the acts concerning the election of the new pope, duly signed by the religious and civil authorities in Rome, and begged the emperor to ratify the choice. In the meantime, they pleaded with the Bishop of Ravenna to persuade the exarch to send a positive report on the election to the emperor. The favor of the exarch was crucial because it would probably decide the position of the court in Constantinople on the new pope. After the death of Honorius in 638, the imperial ratification to the election of his successor, Severinus, had been pending for over a year. Certainly because the new pope had not yet endorsed the ectasis. Then something happened, an episode indicative of the violence and the corruption of the times. The architectural renovation works undertaken by Pope Honorius had attracted the attention of the Byzantines and of a few families of the Roman aristocracy on the church treasures. Apart from huge land properties, buildings, and religious ornaments, the material riches of the church consisted in precious objects donated by emperor, monarchs, and wealthy people, and in the money reserves for current expenses, for the ransom of prisoners, and for charity purposes. The exarch of Ravenna, Isaac the Armenian, had conceived a plan to take advantage of the pending endorsement of the new pope. He was in contact with a high Byzantine official in Rome, Maurice, in charge for tax and administrative matters in Rome, and also for the imperial troops in the city, organized as a city militia, composed of Byzantine soldiers and Roman citizens. in collusion with representatives of important Roman families, Maurice addressed his troops and blamed the Pope for concealing so many treasures in his palace, among which the troops pay, since their salaries sent by the emperor were temporarily deposited with the church. Needless to say, the soldiers promptly surrounded the Lateran palace, the residence of the Pope, hoping to plunder it. Since the servants of the palace resisted and Maurice wanted to avoid needless bloodshed, he ordered to seal up the area where the treasures were stored. Then he invited the Exarch to come to Rome and take what he wanted. Isaac the Armenian arrived in Rome under the shameless pretext of ratifying the Pope's election, but once there, he banished from the city several cardinals and presbyters, and during a whole week he looted the Lateran. Part of the booty went to the troops, another part to the Exarch himself, and a third one was sent to the emperor. After that, the Pope was officially appointed, almost a sop for the pillage. A pillage, mind you, not on an enemy city, but on a city of the empire. Deeds like that contributed to the hostility of the popes towards the ecstasies and to the failure of the reconciliation policy of Heraclio. This episode is an example of how corruption and abuses can lead to turning points in history. Anyway, if you disliked the extortion scheme concocted by Isaac the Armenian, I can tell you that he did not live long enough to enjoy what he had stolen. 2 years later, in 643, the Lombard king Rolle beat the Byzantine army at the Skultenna Creek, and the Exarch was killed in the battle. The Skultenna Creek flows from the Apennines into the Panaro River, which for over a century marked, west of Bologna, the border between the Lombard Kingdom and the Exarchate. As for Maurice, he had already suffered a grim fate. Maybe disappointed by his own cut of the booty, with the support of a few Roman families, he had rebelled against the Exarch. Isaac had then sent other troops to Rome, and Maurice was defeated, arrested, and beheaded, and his head displayed in the circus in Ravenna. Finally, also Pope Severinus had died only 2 months after the plunder, but without endorsing the ecstasies. And his successors refused as well to approve it. On the contrary, at the death of Heraclius in 642, the new Pope, John IV, rushed to write to the new emperor, Constantine III, the father of Constance. He denied that Pope Honorius could have possibly meant that the actions of the Christ were guided by a single will. Honorius had simply meant that the will of the human nature of the Christ was in agreement with that of his divine nature. In the 7th century, subtle distinction on theological matters could cause a bloodbath and even undermine the power of an emperor. Therefore, when Pope John IV died as well in that year 642, the Exarch of Ravenna hurried to impose the election of a pope of Greek origin and formation, Theodore I. However, the actions of the new pope did not correspond at all to the expectations of the Byzantine. Under Theodore's pontificate, the conflict with the Roman Church assumed truly destabilizing proportions. As we have seen, the province of Africa was culturally distant from the Byzantine world. Its clergy sided with Rome on the issue of the ecstasies. The local opposition was inspired by one of the major Byzantine theologians of the Middle Ages, Maximus the Confessor. He belonged to an aristocratic family of Constantinople, received a good philosophical education, and covered, when he was still young, the very important position of first secretary of Emperor Heraclius. Then he quit his career to take monastic vows, and he became the abbot of a monastery across the Bosphorus. When the Persians invaded the area, he moved to Africa, where he started to produce a series of theological works, initially on biblical exegesis and eventually encompassing all fields of religious literature. He had been living for many years in Carthage and had become the tireless champion of the Chalcedonian orthodoxy. Initially, he had directed his activity of polemicist against the Monophysites and then against the efforts of Heraclius to reach a compromise with Monothelites. It was Maximus who took the initiative to call several synods of African bishops, which ended with the condemnation of the ecstasies. It was Maximus who asserted with determination the principle, already expressed by the early fathers of the Church, that the emperor was not entitled to decide on matters of faith. It was the first sign of a long conflict between the papacy and the emperors, which arose in many forms and places throughout the Middle Ages. By the way, Maximus managed to confute so effectively the former Patriarch of Constantinople, Pyrrhus, during a public debate in Carthage, that Pyrrhus abandoned monothelitism and repaired to Rome, accompanied by Maximus. Pope Theodore I received him with full honors and wrote to the bishop who had been present to the consecration of Pyrrhus' successors in Constantinople, and he stated that Pyrrhus had not been removed from his office, but had spontaneously moved his seat to Rome. This was a threat to the legitimacy of the new Patriarch of Constantinople, Paul, a supporter of the ecstasies. But the most serious political consequence of the actions of Maximus was that the exarch of the province of Africa, Gregory, declared a secession from the empire and proclaimed himself Emperor of Africa. The Byzantines could regain the control of the province only because the Arab expedition was defeated and killed Gregory, returning to Egypt with a large booty. Also in Italy, the empire could somewhat limit the damage. Pyrrhus, flattered by an invitation of the exarch to Ravenna, eventually agreed to go back to Constantinople and re-embrace monothelitism, probably against the promise that he would become again Patriarch of Constantinople in a few years' time. In response to that, the Pope excommunicated both Pyrrhus and the current Patriarch of Constantinople, Paul. During the solemn ritual in St. Peter's Cathedral, a drop of Christ's blood, i.e. of the sacramental wine, was dropped into the ink used to write down the anathema. When, in 649, Pope Theodore died, the religious controversy has been enormously exacerbated. The late Pope had been organizing a synod on the ecstasies and the typos, a project that could still be carried out by his successor, all the more so because Maximus was now living in Rome. Furthermore, the religious primacy of the Pope had become a political issue for the citizens of Rome, humiliated by the abuses of power perpetrated by the Byzantines. In conclusion, when the typos was issued in 648, the political temperature in Rome was running too high for a reconciliation. In 649, a new pope was elected, Martin I, an Italian this time, and again a man with a strong personality. The Roman clergy appointed him without even waiting for the imperial confirmation, and equally without imperial consent, Martin, in the same year of his election, called the bishops to the synod planned by his predecessor. At this point, Constans II, tough-minded and inflexible, sent to Italy a new exarch, Olympius, with the task of obtaining the submission of the Roman clergy. In order to induce the bishops to endorse the typos, Olympius had been authorized to imprison the Pope, possibly without provoking the armed resistance of the local militia. In the 7th century, we begin to witness a phenomenon that will become more and more important in medieval Italy. The population of some Italian cities, under the looming threat of foreign powers like the Lombard Kingdom and the Roman Empire, had started to form local armies. The documents use the Latin word exercitum. Those armies gradually became a force to be reckoned with by the Byzantines. In Rome, this militia was mainly composed by members of prominent local families. The synod called by Pope Martin took place in the St. John Lateran Basilica in October 649, at the presence of 105 bishops from western territories of the empire, including Sicily, Sardinia, and the province of Africa. When Olympius arrived in Rome, the synod was still going on, but the solemn condemnation of the ecstasies and the typos had already been pronounced, together with that of the Patriarch of Alexandria Cyrus, with that of Constantinople Sergius, and of his successors, Pyrrhus and Paul. The exarch settled in the palace of the Caesars, by then only partly inhabitable, and tried in vain to obtain the support of the officers of the city militia and of participants to the synod. Also, an attempt to assassinate the Pope. There was an attempt to assassinate the Pope when he was about to give communion to Olympius in the Basilica of St. Mary. You can imagine the climate of fear and intimidation reigning in Rome. Nevertheless, the determination of the Roman people and the failure of the assassination attempt dissuaded Olympius from further actions. In fact, he opted for an astonishing turnaround. In fact, he reconciled with the Pope, and with the support of his own troops, proclaimed himself emperor. As it had happened in Africa with the ecstasies, the typos had provoked a military uprising. However, once more, Constans was lucky. Not much later, an Arab fleet landed in Sicily and started to raid it systematically, including churches and monasteries. Olympius moved to Sicily with his troops, but once there, he fell sick and died. And this put an end to the rebellion, and Constans sent to Italy another exarch, Theodore Calliopas. In 653, he arrived in Rome with an army, and this time he arrested the Pope without further notice, declaring him an usurper, since his pontificate had never received the imperial confirmation. The circumstances of the arrest were spectacular. The exarch and his soldiers found the Pope in the Lateran Basilica, where Martin, who was too infirm to stand, was lying on a couch in front of the main altar, surrounded by high priests. The exarch read aloud the decree with the Pope's deposition, after which the priests anathematized the exarch. In the turmoil that followed, the Byzantine soldiers drew their swords and toppled the large candles on the altar. Then they dragged the Pope out of the church and carried him to the palace of the Caesars, where they locked him up. During the night, Martin was boarded on a boat moored on the Tiber and transferred to the nearby city of Porto, where another ship would take him to Constantinople. The Exarch had ordered to bolt the city gates to avoid that the people may try to reach Porto and free the Pope. After a journey of 3 months, Martin arrived in Constantinople and he was imprisoned on charge of lese majesty, of conspiracy with Olympius, and even of having called the Arabs to invade Sicily. He stood a political trial in which he was mistreated and humiliated. Any attempt of the defendant to address the issue of the typos, which was the true reason for the trial, was frustrated. Martin was sentenced to death, shamed and dragged to the place of the public execution, whereby at the last moment, by order of Constance, the sentence was suspended and he was deported to Kherson in southern Crimea, where the old man died 2 years later of hardship and starvation. Constance had yet to settle the score with Maximus, who had been a key player in the Lateran Synod, the formal pronouncements of which closely reflected Maximus' language and argumentations. In 653, the theologian was arrested in Rome and taken to Constantinople, where he was charged of having caused the rebellion of the Exarch Gregory in Africa. After a long trial, Maximus was exiled and subjected for years to psychological pressure and mistreatment in the hope that he would recant his position against the typos. Eventually, in 662, when Maximus was already more than 80 years old, he was accused again of heresy and imprisoned in a fortress in the remote region of Lazica in Caucasus, where they cut him off his tongue and right hand. Maximus died a couple of years later. His works, not easy to find and read, are not very well known today, but they had a large circulation during the Middle Ages. Both he and Pope Martin were later declared saints, both by the Roman and by the Eastern Church. In Rome, while Martin was still prisoner, the Byzantine had imposed the election of a new pope, not without some resistance of the Roman people and clergy. Anyway, not even then Constance obtained an endorsement of the typos by the Roman Church. But the issue was not over yet. In the meantime, the toughness of Constance II on issues of power had also affected his own family. As customary at the time, Constance's brother Theodore should have been co-regent. However, the relationship between the two brothers was not good. Constantine initially granted the co-regency to his own son, who later became emperor under the name of Constantine IV, and then he ordered Theodore to be locked up in a monastery. Eventually, he accused him of treason and had him executed. The crime coming on top of the ill treatment reserved to the Pope and to Maximus alienated Constance from the people who began to call him Cain. This widespread hostility in Constantinople, coupled with the strategic consideration, made the emperor conceive a risky project. Let us consider the situation of the empire. The 7th century was an age of great changes, of migrations, conquest, and collapses of civilizations. The Sasanian Empire had crumbled, and the Roman Empire had enemies on all sides. In 655, Constance had suffered a great naval defeat by the fleet of Muawiyah. Then the civil war erupted in the Caliphate and granted him a providential truce, which Constans used to lead a successful campaign in the Balkans. He subdued the Slavs and deported many of them to Anatolia, a territory exposed to raids by the Caliphate armies. Constant had also to defend control of the Mediterranean. At the center of it is the Strait of Sicily, a point of great strategic importance, dividing the Great Sea into an eastern and a western basin, each one with its own history. To the south, the strait was guarded by Carthage, but its inland was mostly controlled by Berber tribes and exposed to the risk of Arab raids. Carthage was too far from Constantinople to be protected from a large-scale attack. To the north of the strait, the power of the Lombards over Italy had grown significantly. Their kingdom in the upper part of the peninsula had expanded and become more solid. The two Lombard duchies in the south were also a source of concerns. The more because one of them was ruled by the son of King Grimoald, so that a future union between the kingdom and the Duchy of Benevento could not be excluded. The latent hostility of the Romans, proven by the rejection of the Typos, was an additional sign of alarm for the future. If the Byzantine presence in south of Italy had been reinforced, this would have strengthened both the Exarchate of Ravenna and that of Carthage, and improved the control on the center of the Mediterranean. Therefore, with an audacious operation, in 663, Constans landed in Apulia with a fleet, aiming at regaining control on Italy by making of Rome the new capital of the empire. Initially, Constans' troops conquered several cities, but when they attacked Benevento, where the young Duke Romuald led the resistance, they could not take it. After a few months, during which the Byzantines employed in vain their siege machines, news came that the Duke's father, the redoubtable King Grimoald, just returning from a victory upon the Franks, was approaching with a large army. Constans abandoned the siege and reached the Byzantine enclave of Naples with his troops, not without a hard clash with a Lombard contingent coming from Capua in rescue of Benevento. Once in Naples, a Byzantine general persuaded the emperor to let him lead an expedition against the Lombards. So he headed with part of the army towards Benevento. The news reached Duke Romuald, who in the meantime had reunited with his father. He rushed to confront the Byzantines, and the two armies faced each other near the small town of Forino, halfway between Benevento and Naples. The Lombard historian Paul the Deacon, who, having spent years in the cloister of Monte Cassino, had certainly spoken with descendants of the fighters, gave us a vivid picture of how the battle was quickly decided. In the initial clash between the two cavalries, a large Lombard warrior armed with a contus, the two-handed lance that exalted the concussive force of a galloping horse, pierced with it the body of Agricola and lifted him up above the melee. This sight struck terror into the Byzantine cavalry, which swerved and was routed. This defeat put an end to Constans' dream to conquer southern Italy. So he headed for Rome after leaving in Naples parts of his troops. In Rome there was, since 657, Pope Vitalian, with whom Constance had managed to restore decent relations by endorsing his elections without delay and by acknowledging that the Holy See headed the Catholic Church. The issue of the tupos remained open. Since the end of the Western Roman Empire, no Byzantine emperor had set foot in Rome. The arrival of Constance must have been expected with suspicion and concern. It was an extraordinary event with unpredictable consequences. The Liber Pontificalis described the reception ceremony, identical to that which centuries later will be reserved to the German emperors after the Church chose another empire as a protector. The Pope, the clergy, and the civil authorities waited for Constance at the 6th mile south of Rome with their crosses, their candles, and their banners. On July 5th, 663, the emperor, coming from the Appian Way, entered in Rome. In his monumental work, The History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages, Ferdinand Gregorovius observed that the Romans, impoverished and surrounded by ruins, must have made a few sad considerations under the disdainful look of the Byzantine courtiers. We do not know precisely because, in the words of Gregorovius, an impenetrable silence enveloped those years. Nothing has been reported about games, nothing about distributions of money, nor of simple bread, nothing about restoration works ordered by the emperor, nor the chronicler reports how much the despot took from the church's treasure in return for the honor of his visit. Gregorovius compared this visit of Constance with that of his homonym Constantius II, the emperor's son of Constantine the Great, which took place in 357, described in memorable pages by Ammianus Marcellinus. Ammianus had depicted the admiration of Constantius for the large population of Rome and the breathtaking splendor of the monuments, the Capitol, the magnificent thermal baths, the Flavian Amphitheater, the Pantheon, the Temple of Venus and Rome, the Theater of Pompey, the Odeum, the Stadium of Domitian, and, above all, the Forum of Trajan. I quote again Gregorovius on the visit of Constance in 663. After about 300 years of terrible events, a Roman emperor was contemplating again those masterpieces. However, his barbarian-like ignorance will have hardly recalled one or two names, then almost legendary, nor would the archaeologists of the time, if any of them at all accompanied this visit, have been able to illustrate those monuments to him with the erudition of a Cassiodorus. In 3 centuries, Rome had been reduced to the ghost of itself. The temple of Jupiter was in ruins, the thermal baths abandoned, the fountains dry. In the amphitheater, while weeds grew, the dilapidated walls crumbled. Only a small portion of the imperial palace was still inhabitable, the rest only ruins. Only the temple of peace and the other four, nothing by rubbles and desert. Only the column of Trajan and that of Marcus Aurelius stood in their impressive splendor amid shaky temples and emptied libraries, in which, here and there, the blackened statue of a Greek or Roman genius still resisted oblivion. The circus and the theater, gradually succumbing to the assaults of times, crumbled. The Greek temple of Venus and Rome, recently stripped of its roof, lay semi-destroyed. Only the general layout of the ancient city survived, its streets and squares within which the Christian city was slowly rising, with its cloisters leaning against the ancient walls, with its many churches rising amid the ruins of the classical buildings, often made of their own stone. Churches, the history of which was already fading into obscurity and myth. In the 12 days they spent in Rome, the Byzantine took away a lot. Constance ordered that the nice bronze tiles of the Pantheon be removed, regardless of the fact that the building had been turned long ago into a church. The few statues that even the Vandals had spared were loaded on Byzantine ships and disappeared forever. Miraculously, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which adorns today the Capitol Hill, remained in Rome, probably to mitigate the theft of the even more famous equestrian statue of Constantine, which stood near the Arch of Septimius Severus. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Roman people believed, as if repressing memories of the outrage suffered, that the statues of Marcus Aurelius represented Constantine. After stripping the city of what he could carry away, the emperor sailed toward Naples. The military defeat he had suffered made him discard the idea of making Rome the capital of the empire. The ancient city of Syracuse in Sicily was further away from the Lombards and much more closer to the province of Africa. It would become the empire's new capital. In Rome, Constance must have perceived the people's hostility. Before leaving the city, he granted to the Church of Ravenna the autokephalia in Greek. That is, the Archbishop of Ravenna no longer reported to Rome, a severe limitation to the power of the popes. Once in Sicily, Constance, who had to finance an army, a fleet, and a court, submitted the empire's territories in southern Italy, Sicily, Calabria, and Sardinia, to atrocious exactions, unheard of before, stated the author of the Liber Pontificalis. He had done the same thing in Apulia and Campania just after his arrival. Having come to Italy to drive away the Lombards, he ended up pillaging his own subjects and reducing them to despair. As it seems, many Sicilians, exasperated by those exactions, fled as far as Syria, where they became Muslims. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the whole idea of transferring the empire's capital to Italy had not been well received. The Senate had not even allowed Constance to take his wife and children to Italy. Therefore, in 668, a conspiracy put an end to the designs and to the life of Constance. In the bathroom of his palace in Syracuse, a servant crushed his skull with a bronze vase. After that, Misicius, an Armenian general who had followed Constance in Italy, was proclaimed emperor, although he was probably not the mind behind the conspiracy. In any case, this nomination was not recognized by Constantinople. A Byzantine fleet reached Syracuse, and the conspirators were executed, including Misicius. The Italian adventure was over, and Constance's adolescent son became emperor with the name of Constantine IV. He will be a great emperor, and we will talk about him in the next 2 lectures. Historical judgments on Constans II have been mostly negative, both in Italy, in the Liber Pontificalis, and in the Historia Langobardorum of Paul the Deacon, and in Constantinople, where there was a sort of damnatio memoriae on him. In other words, he was practically consigned to oblivion. But is such negative judgment fully justified for Constans II? Over time, some historians have partially re-evaluated his figure. Constans II was only 38 years old when he was assassinated. However, he had ruled already for 26 years. Undeniably, he had to face from the beginning a very difficult situation. During his life, he waged war incessantly against the enemies of the empire. If you have seen the 2 videos dedicated to the Arab conquest of Syria and Egypt, you know better than Paul the Deacon why Constant subjected Rome and southern Italy to brutal exactions. Just before Constans came to power, the richest provinces of the Roman Empire had been conquered by the Arabs, and Constans' financial situation was probably very difficult. Unfortunately, the treasures he had taken to Syracuse were plundered by raiders from Egypt only 6 years later, and every trace of them was lost. Constans was often very heavy-handed on power issues. For instance, when he tried to impose the tupos in Rome, and with his brother Theodore. However, we have to acknowledge that we know very little about the situation with his brother, and concerning the assassination of relatives, Constans was an absolute beginner in comparison with the founder of Constantinople, Constantine the Great. Finally, for what concerns the tupos, we should try as well to be balanced in our judgment. This edict was mainly an attempt to contain religious sectarianism. I have read the Heraclius Hectasis, which preceded the tupos. The Latin and Greek classic series of the Lorenzo Valla Foundation has published this rare text, together with a long refutation of it written by Maximus the Confessor. I share with you my impression on it for what it counts, since I'm certainly not an expert on Byzantine theology. The text signed by Heraclius, although it was almost certainly written by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius, appears moderate and sensible to a modern reader. And the tupos was also, in a way, a forerunner of a more secular conception of the state. By contrast, the tone of Maximus' refutation, addressed to Heraclius himself, is harder, insistent, vaguely sarcastic, at times obscure in its argumentation. The combined impression that these 2 texts give is that the historical facts convey only a small portion of the political atmospheres of those times. Simple facts fail to make us fully appreciate the great power held then by the clergy, to which all the intellectuals of the time belonged. All the intellectuals belonged to the church, or rather to the churches. And this because the non-religious education system had nearly everywhere collapsed. My impression is that this power was much stronger, much more pervasive, much more destabilizing for the state than one could infer from the many events that dot an historical narration: the battles, the uprisings, the deaths of popes and emperors. We shall return on the issue of the growing power of the church and of the monks in particular. After all, we are only at the beginning of our journey through the Middle Ages. As for the Church of Rome, during the age of Constantine II, it became clear that its destiny was going to diverge from that of the Eastern Empire. As for Eastern monasticism, the time was approaching when emperors would use a terrible, non-conventional weapon against it: the iconoclastic movement. We will deal with this subject in other videos. For now, I wish to thank you for your interest and especially thank my subscribers who do not speak Italian for their patience while I was publishing a few videos in my native language. Now I'm working on other videos in English. So see you soon. A presto.